Their point.
An official tally of votes in Israel's parliamentary elections confirmed on Thursday former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's triumphant return to power at the head of a right-wing nationalist and religious alliance.
Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, head of communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. Israel has been through several elections in the past few years. In fact, Israel has had 5 elections in just 4 years. The most recent elections, the ones that took place on November 1st, saw an important rise of the far right in Israel. In this episode of What Matters Today, we look at the impact of the far right in Israel. We also examine how the far right helped Benjamin Netanyahu win the election. And finally, we discuss the general reaction of Palestinians to the election results. My guest for this episode is Cyrus Schayegh, who is a professor of international history and politics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Please note that this episode was recorded in mid-November. The UK is getting lots of attention because it's had 5 prime ministers in just 6 years. However, Israel has had 5 elections in just 4 years. So what is actually happening and what's causing this situation?
In one word, Netanyahu. And in 3 words, Netanyahu and Lieberman. Who is Lieberman? He is the head of the party Israel Beitenu. Israel is our house or our home, which is a party that's principally, but not exclusively, voted for by Russian immigrants in Israel. Very reliably right-wing, part of multiple Netanyahu-Likud-led coalitions for years. Earlier in his life, working directly with and for Netanyahu. Anyway, long story short, the start of this election after election cycle was when Lieberman, quite unexpectedly, in actual fact, refused to recommend Netanyahu for prime ministership. Like 4 years ago when that happened. And that basically triggered the whole crisis. Now, he had his reasons. Some of them are personal, some of them are indeed political, and some have to do with the fact that, Netanyahu was basically being accused and was started to, have to slowly, look at the possibility of having to go to court for multiple, from multiple reasons, for multiple infractions. Yeah. So this started this whole. If Lieberman wouldn't have done this, none of this would have happened. That's number one. Now, what happened thereafter then is that a number of people who, broadly speaking, are in the center, could be perhaps a little bit identified with the right, always using an Israeli yardstick by which what is left and right, emerged. This was Benny Gantz about 4 years ago, and started to really change the political landscape at that point in time. And, almost basically getting to power, but not quite. I'm not going to go through all the iterations of what happened in, the election since then. But long story short, until this last election, where a Likud-led right-wing and religious coalition won the majority of votes by a little bit, and the majority of Knesset seats, parliament seats, by a good bit, 64, I think, out of 120. Until this last election, everything was simply just going in a circle. And there were simply enough people also from the center-right who were not willing anymore to work with Netanyahu. But not for ideological reasons, simply for political, sometimes personal, sometimes judicial reasons, as it were.
Very interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the far right, so let's discuss the far right in Israel. Many headlines have said that Netanyahu and his far right allies actually won the Israeli election, with some even saying that Netanyahu's made his comeback thanks to the far right. And in fact, the New York Times mentioned that, and quote, to win the election, Benjamin Netanyahu and his far right allies harnessed perceived threats to Israel's Jewish identity after ethnic unrest last year and the subsequent inclusion of Arab lawmakers in the government, end quote. How will this rise of the far right impact Israel moving forward?
It will, but before I answer this one, let me, look backwards in time a little bit. I do think that, Jewish Arab or Jewish Palestinian internal Israeli clashes that happened in early 2021 had something to do with the right-wing win this time, but I'm convinced that what was much more important was what you mentioned second, which is the fact that a Arab party was, for the very first time in the history of the State of Israel, formally part of the government coalition. And that was really, that was a real break, right, in all sorts of different ways. And in some ways, you know how Trump followed Obama, partly because substantial minority of white voters in the United States simply couldn't, I think, live with the idea that the non-white, particularly an African, would be American president. In some ways comparable to that, right-wing, particularly extreme right-wing, really fascist Israelis, because there is no other way for it, were incensed by the fact that now there is an Arab party in the government, right? And the faction within the, extreme right-wing coalition party that, has become most influential, that, by Itamar Ben-Gvir, ran a campaign slogan that said something like, who is actually the master of the house here? That was sort of the slogan. And that, tells you a lot.
Right.
So I think this, is one reason for what happened. A second reason is more long-standing. The Likud itself has really changed in the last 10 to 15 years. It's not what it used to be even 10, 15 years ago. Lots of parliamentarians themselves of the Likud itself defend and advocate ideological positions that are, for all matters and purposes, very close to, if not more or less identical with those of Itamar Ben-Gvir, right? And the other people in this sort of, really far right left, party coalition. And that tells you something as well, too, about the direction in which a small but important majority of the Israeli public has been developing in the last years. And there are various reasons for this. Some have to do with, cynical politicians using the Arab issue in order to get their way, and Netanyahu leads that pack. Others have to do with more internal demographic or more broader demographic, ideological sort of, developments in Israel itself. But the result is one, namely precisely the sort of, rise of that party. And, it bears mentioning that this very same party just, I think, 3 years ago, or that faction of the party that's led by Ben-Gvir just 3 years ago, I think won 0.5% at elections. That's it. So it's really a hallucinating, meteoric sort of rise, right? And I think that shows that the participation in the Israeli government of the Ra'am Arab political party, really was a red flag, for those people. Yeah. So that's sort of, looking back. Looking forward, I can't see any situation in which life will become more progressive or anything of that sort. That just, goes, that's maybe, stupid to say, but just goes without saying. Exactly what the extent of change will be, I think that remains to be seen. There will be changes, and they will be ugly. But I mean, to somebody like me, of course, not at all to somebody like those people who voted for, basically voted these parties in. But it definitely is not going to go in a progressive direction. Now, I do want to, say one thing that I think is quite important to sort of keep in mind too, which is the fact that in Israel, as in some other, really hyper-capitalist Western countries, including the United States, one important reason why people keep voting in parties that are basically attractive for ideological and cultural reasons rather than for economic reasons is the fact that the very pressing economic woes of the country are not being picked up as a standard, as a flag by any party. Everybody knows that, the situation is really problematic. Rents are extremely high, and so on and so forth, to just, state one issue. But no party ultimately is willing and or able to turn this into the center of its own platform. Ideological, cultural issues are ultimately the ones that help voters decide for whom they want to vote. And this is only partly, as it were, the responsibility of the voters themselves. I do feel that if there would be a genuine secular party that actually genuinely cares about the also economic well-being of some people in the geographic and in the social and in the economic peripheries of the country, then things might sort of change, right?
Right.
But that's simply not, maybe this is going to start now. Maybe the shock is so large now that this is going to start. Well, one last bit that I want to add has to do with sort of the two different ways of sort of understanding what actually happened in those elections, right? One would be to say that on the ground, not really that much has changed. Why? Because people voting for leftist or centrist or Arab parties were actually almost as many as people writing for religious and right-wing parties. They failed to again win basically to end being able to put together a coalition because they were too busy fighting each other internally. So if things would have been organized differently, and there are multiple responsibles here, then we might have seen a somewhat different picture. Maybe not an entirely different picture, but perhaps a somewhat different picture. Netanyahu may have still won 61 seats or 62 seats, but it might have not been 64, 65. So to say that there is a total sea change here, that this is, on something absolutely, is something really new starts, is in a certain ways a misreading, I think, of this, electoral map. But it is not a misreading of the electoral map, in the sense that what counts in the end is the outcome, right? And also in the sense that, this is writing that has been on the wall for a long time. And a lot of commentators have mentioned this, that at some point in time, this simply, would happen. And that the everything but Bibi Netanyahu coalition that was ideologically so heterogeneous would fall apart and not be able to, basically push back against Netanyahu. What has hurt those leftists and centrists as well is their continued inability or unwillingness to actually politically work together with all Arab parties. Though one mustn't say that some Arab parties themselves don't really want to be part of a coalition. But I do think that perhaps in the months and hopefully years to come, there will be sort of a rethink there. Hopefully from my standpoint, right? Secular Israelis who vote for centrist and leftist parties will start to understand that the only way back to, government control is cooperation with all Arab parties, that there simply is no way around it. Now, it appears to me, though, that the majority voiced, let's say a majority of the voices that one sort of, hears on the secular sort of leftist centrist side since the elections don't really talk about this that much. What they talk about much more is we want some sort of autonomy, whether it is greater educational autonomy, whether it is more, rights and more responsibilities for municipalities, whatever it might be, that sort of direction. And they're saying we want to be treated the same way that the religious Jews are being treated. We want to have our own tribe and leave us alone, and that's the end of that.
Right.
And a lot of people also always every single time a right-wing prime minister, particularly after a long period of time, gets voted into office, there is always, certainly since the 1990s, there has been talk about simply leaving, getting up and just leaving and migrating. Right, so that's also something that a good number of people talk about. It has never really happened on a massive scale. But then again, you never know. I mean, if politics develop in a really, let's just say, unpleasant direction, this definitely might be something that happens.
And for my final question, the Norwegian Refugee Council recently stated that Israel's election, this is the quote, Israel's election result may mean further oppression from already suffocated Palestinians, unquote. What has been the general reaction of Palestinians to the election results?
Well, definitely not pleasant surprise, but I also don't think shock and definitely disgust, but definitely not sort of shock like it has been on the part of secular Jewish Israelis. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. I think one is that, from the viewpoint and in the life experience, most importantly, of both Israel's own Palestinian citizens and Palestinians living in the West Bank and in Gaza, there really isn't that much daylight between centrists and, rightist governments.
Right. Yeah.
The way the Israeli government has continued to occupy/manage the West Bank and Gaza in the last year and a half hasn't really been different, from Netanyahu's sort of, previous government. So from their point of view right now, they may be feeling, well, we'll just see what happens, but, how much worse can it get? But of course, it can always get worse, right? I mean, that goes without saying too. And I do think that some of them, of course, do, understand that. And, the opportunities are ample. I mean, they may, it may involve Ben-Gvir or somebody else, on the extreme right, on the fascist right, making a visit to the Temple Mount and simply unleashing a sort of authority. Or it may come as a result of, Ben-Gvir and some others actually taking on key security-related ministerial portfolios. I mean, Ben-Gvir wants to become, Minister of Internal Security, which manages the police and all that, which is doubly crazy in some ways because he doesn't have a particularly good relationship with the police. He has been, I don't know whether convicted, but certainly indicted, for all sorts of different things before. And the same thing goes for his colleague Smotrich as well, right? So we will see how all of this develops.
This has been very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Thank you.
That was Professor Cyrus Schayegh discussing the recent Israeli elections. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.